Gaius Julius Caesar was undoubtedly one of the most powerful men of the ancient world. He led the Roman forces in the Gallic Wars, which was actually my very first encounter with him, because, you know, Asterix and Obelix. He became a dictator and played a crucial role in the events that led to the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. If you enjoy this video about him, I'd really appreciate a like and a subscription. Now, let's dive in. Caesar was most likely born on July 12, 100 BCE, though some sources suggest it may have been 2 years earlier. He was born into a patrician family. The patricians were descendants of Rome's old aristocratic families and were originally the only full Roman citizens, though that distinction had been abolished by Caesar's time. His family was certainly notable, though not among the most influential. They traced their lineage back to Iulus, who, according to mythology, was the son of Aeneas, the legendary hero of the Trojan War, founder of the Roman nation, and son of the goddess Venus. Aeneas was also one of the few figures said to have successfully passed by Cerberus, the three-headed dog guarding the underworld. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a praetor, a magistrate responsible for legal matters in the capital. His mother, Aurelia, came from a more influential family, with several consuls among her ancestors. Consuls, at the time, were the highest-ranking civil officials in Rome. Caesar had 2 sisters, both named Julia, because, as we know, Roman naming traditions weren't exactly creative. I don't know where this idea started, but I've come across claims that the term Caesarean section comes from Caesar himself, as he was supposedly born that way. That, however, isn't true. While there are records of C-sections being performed in ancient Rome, medical knowledge was so limited that the procedure was only used in cases where it was certain the mother wouldn't survive, so at least the child could be saved. But Caesar's mother lived for several decades after his birth, and no historical sources mention any complications during her labor. Not much is known about Caesar's childhood. Even though biographies were written after he rose to prominence in Rome, thousands of years have passed, and much has been lost. What we do know is that Rome, at the time of his upbringing, was in turmoil. The Republic was at war with its Italian allies, who demanded Roman citizenship. Meanwhile, Mithridates, the king of Pontus, was threatening Rome's eastern provinces. On top of that, Rome was deeply divided internally. The political scene was split between the Optimates, staunchly conservative aristocrats, and the populares, who sought to improve conditions for the lower and middle classes and were generally more liberal. Caesar's uncle, Marius, was a leader of the populares, while the Optimates were led by Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Both had achieved major victories in the social war and now competed for command in the war against Mithridates. In the end, Sulla was given the command, but after he left for the east, Marius was appointed in his place. Upon hearing this, Sulla turned his legions around and marched on Rome, forcing Marius into exile. Once Sulla had restored control, he resumed his eastern campaign. However, Marius later returned with his ally, Lucius Cornelius Cinna, seized power in Rome, and declared Sulla a public enemy. At first glance, this might have seemed like a victory for Caesar's family. His uncle was now the ruler of Rome. Unlike his father, Caesar was far more ambitious. At around 14 or 15 years old, he was already thinking about how to climb the social ladder. But then came a setback. Marius died shortly after his triumph. The populares remained in power for a while, but in 85 BCE, Caesar's father also passed away. At just 16, Caesar became the head of his family. He needed to secure his position, so he got engaged to Casucia, a wealthy girl from an equestrian family, a rank below the patricians but still respectable. Some sources suggest they were even married. However, another opportunity soon arose, marrying Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna. Seeing a chance to solidify his standing, Caesar broke off his engagement, or possibly even divorced Casucia, and married Cornelia instead. That same year, he was appointed as the Flamen Diolis, a priest dedicated to Jupiter. This was one of the 3 most prestigious priesthoods in Rome. It might seem like Caesar was already making his way up the ranks, but things were about to take a drastic turn. During this time, Sulla had defeated Mithridates, made peace with him, and returned to Rome to confront Marius's successors. This led to the outbreak of what is now known as Sulla's Civil War. The conflict ended with a decisive battle near Rome, where Sulla emerged victorious and declared himself dictator of the Republic. Now, Caesar and others affiliated with the populares were in serious danger. Sulla ordered Caesar to resign from his priesthood and divorce Cornelia. But Caesar refused, partly out of pride, partly because he was still a rebellious teenager. Unfortunately for him, Sulla was the dictator and held all the power. As a result, Caesar was placed on the proscription list, a register of public enemies, effectively marking him for death. He went into hiding to save his life, but eventually, thanks to his mother's influence, she had supported Sulla and held some sway. A compromise was reached. Caesar was allowed to keep his wife and his movable wealth but had to forfeit his priesthood and properties. With little reason to stay in Rome, where he wasn't exactly welcome anymore, Caesar joined the military and was sent to Asia. He was assigned a mission to request support from Nicomedes IV, the king of Bithynia. He stayed at Nicomedes' court for so long that rumors began circulating about the nature of their relationship. In ancient Rome, the issue wasn't that two men might be involved. That wasn't inherently scandalous. Many ancient civilizations didn't care whether a man preferred men or women. What mattered in Roman culture was who held the dominant role. For a Roman man, especially one of status, it was considered acceptable to be the one conquering, but being conquered was seen as disgraceful. The gossip wasn't about Caesar and Nicomedes having a relationship, it was that Nicomedes was supposedly the dominant partner. That was what damaged Caesar's reputation. However, he later earned a prestigious military decoration for saving a fellow soldier in battle, which helped restore his image. Realistically, the rumors were likely baseless. Even if Caesar had been attracted to men, he had access to plenty of slaves in Rome who would have been more appealing than Nicomedes, who was already past his prime. Additionally, later writings suggest that Caesar was more interested in women, many women. The scandal was mostly a lingering shadow over his reputation, brought up occasionally by his political opponents. Regardless, Caesar's military achievements soon overshadowed the rumors. He received the civic crown, one of the highest honors a Roman citizen could earn. It was made of oak leaves, and its recipients wore it during public occasions. This moment likely fueled Caesar's hunger for further glory. After all, who wouldn't enjoy that kind of recognition? After 2 years of absolute rule, Sulla unexpectedly stepped down as dictator and restored the republic. Historians still debate why he did it. Maybe he had grown tired of power, or perhaps the constant paranoia of assassination had taken a toll on him. Maybe he had simply achieved everything he wanted and just wanted peace in his old age. After all, he died 2 years later, in 78 BCE. He spent those 2 years of leisure near Naples, in the company of his fifth wife, plenty of actors, dancers, and women of questionable virtue. Then he suddenly fell ill, likely due to liver problems from excessive drinking, and died surrounded by his loved ones. When Caesar learned that Sulla was out of the picture, he returned to Rome. Since he didn't have much money at the time, he settled in a house in one of the poorer districts. He had the opportunity to join a conspiracy but ultimately decided to take a more rhetorical approach, as he was already an excellent speaker, even at a young age. He embarked on a career as a public advocate, the equivalent of a lawyer in those days. Although he lost his first case, he still impressed as a brilliant orator. Even Cicero praised him. Moreover, Caesar took great pleasure in prosecuting former provincial governors who were notorious for corruption and extortion, which earned him considerable public favor. In 75 BCE, Caesar decided to sail to Rhodes to study philosophy and rhetoric under Cicero's teacher. However, on his way there, he was captured by pirates who held him for ransom. They demanded 20 talents of gold, but Caesar laughed in their faces, claiming they had no idea who they had captured and that he would be insulted if they didn't demand at least double. His supporters scrambled to gather the money, and when Caesar finally ransomed himself, he swore to the pirates that he would one day return and punish them. It seemed like a joke. Caesar laughed, the pirates laughed, but they had no idea that he would actually come back for them. Later, the provincial authorities refused to crucify the pirates as Caesar wanted, instead selling them into slavery. But Caesar eventually tracked them down and, on his own authority, had them crucified. So, who's laughing now? Given the dramatic nature of the story, many historians have doubted whether it actually happened. The only account of it comes from Plutarch, who wrote about it more than 150 years after Caesar's death. While it's unlikely he completely invented the story, he may have embellished it to reinforce Caesar's image as a fearless and self-assured figure. At 25, Caesar certainly didn't have enough political power to amass that much gold, and while his later rise would be fueled by his need to pay off debts, he primarily accumulated those debts while running for various offices, but we'll get to that later. After the pirate incident, Caesar continued on to Rhodes but was soon recalled to Asia. He was in Rome around the time of Spartacus' revolt, and between 73 and 71 BCE, he was elected a military officer, which is considered his first step into politics. However, it's unclear what role he played in suppressing the rebellion. In 62 BCE, he was elected an official responsible for investigating and prosecuting capital crimes, which also secured him a lifetime seat in the Senate. That same year, he delivered a eulogy for his deceased Aunt Julia, the widow of Marius. I mention this because, during the funeral procession, Caesar had Marius banned portraits carried through the streets, causing an uproar, especially among Sulla's supporters, who were struggling in Rome at the time. However, it was tradition to display a husband's image at an aristocratic woman's funeral, so in the end, Caesar hadn't done anything particularly extreme. That same year, Caesar's daughter Julia was born, but shortly after childbirth, his wife Cornelia died. Caesar then left to serve in Hispania, where he reportedly saw a statue of Alexander the Great. It was at that moment that he realized he was the same age as Alexander when he had already conquered much of the known world, while Caesar had achieved nothing comparable. This revelation pushed him to pursue his political career more aggressively. When he returned to Rome, he quickly remarried, taking Pompeia as his wife, Sulla's granddaughter, bringing his journey full circle in a truly ironic twist. He was also elected an aedile, a position often used as a stepping stone to higher offices. In this role, he restored monuments celebrating Marius' victories, which was controversial given that Sulla's supporters still held significant power in Rome, but Caesar knew how to win people over. He organized grand public games, which the Roman populace loved, and restored family trophies and memorials. A crucial year for Caesar was 63 BCE, when he was elected praetor, one of Rome's highest-ranking magistrates, and also became Pontifex Maximus, the chief religious official. Reportedly, he had to spend a great deal of money on bribes to secure the position. While bribes alone wouldn't have been enough, they certainly helped. As praetor, he was supported by the tribune, but along with Metellus Celer, he proposed such controversial policies that the Senate stripped them of their offices. Only after public outcry forced the Senate's hand were their positions reinstated, but another scandal soon followed. Around that time, the festival of Bona Dea, an all-female religious ceremony, was held at Caesar's house, organized by his wife. Somehow, a young patrician, likely hoping to seduce Pompeia, managed to sneak in disguised as a woman. He was caught and charged with sacrilege. Caesar, despite being a great orator, chose not to present any evidence against the man, as he didn't want to make enemies among Rome's powerful patrician families. The accused ended up paying off enough people to be acquitted. To avoid any suspicion falling on his wife, Caesar divorced her, famously stating that even Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. A praetor's term lasted 1 year, and when it ended, Caesar was appointed governor of a province in Hispania. However, he still had substantial debts, and his creditors feared that if he left for Hispania, they would never see their money again. Caesar wasn't allowed to leave until he settled his debts, as his creditors threatened legal action. He turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, promising to politically support him against Pompey in exchange for financial backing. Crassus paid off some of Caesar's debts and guaranteed the rest, allowing him to depart. Still, many creditors were furious and threatened lawsuits, so Caesar left for Hispania as quickly as possible. There, he proved to be an exceptionally capable commander, launching aggressive campaigns that earned him a reputation as a skilled military leader. His primary goal was to amass as much loot as possible to repay his debts. He also managed to defeat the Lusitanians, which secured him the right to celebrate a triumph in Rome since he was now officially a victorious general. At the same time, he aspired to become a consul, the highest political position one could attain in Rome. However, this created a bit of a dilemma. To celebrate his triumph, he had to remain outside the city with his soldiers until the festivities began. Meanwhile, elections were taking place, and to participate, he would have had to relinquish his command and enter the city as a private citizen. He petitioned the Senate for permission to run in absentia, but this request was denied. In the end, he prioritized the consulship. The entire election process, however, was deeply corrupt. There were 3 main candidates: Gaius Julius Caesar, Lucius, and Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. Caesar formed an alliance with Lucius, while the senator Cato supported Bibulus through bribery. Ultimately, Caesar and Bibulus were elected consuls. But Caesar wasn't content with just that, he wanted more. He successfully reconciled Crassus and Pompey, despite originally siding with Crassus against Pompey. Crassus and Pompey had been at odds for years, and Caesar positioned himself between them. Together, they had enough wealth and political influence to control public affairs. Each of them had their own ambitions, and they all recognized the advantages of forming an alliance. This led to the creation of what would later be known as the First Triumvirate. At this stage, it was still an unofficial agreement, but their bond was further solidified when Caesar married his daughter, Julia, to Pompey. He himself also married that year, taking Calpurnia, the daughter of Lucius Piso, as his wife. Piso would become consul the following year. The First Triumvirate was publicly acknowledged in a rather dramatic fashion. Caesar proposed a law to redistribute land to the poor, and both Pompey and Crassus publicly supported him. To reinforce their power and deter opposition, Pompey even stationed his soldiers in Rome, which intimidated those who might have objected to their alliance. Bibulus attempted to resist by arguing that the political climate was not suitable for passing new laws and declared the land reform invalid. However, the law focused on distributing land to the poor, which made it widely popular. Caesar's supporters forcefully expelled Bibulus from the forum, escalating the situation into chaos. 2 of Bibulus's accompanying tribunes were wounded, and he himself was struck with excrement. Fearing for his life, he withdrew to his home for the remainder of his term. He rarely appeared in public, occasionally trying to obstruct Caesar's actions symbolically, but his efforts had little real effect. Cato also tried to oppose Caesar, managing to rally some resistance and causing political trouble for him. When Caesar's consulship ended, his legislative decisions were challenged by 2 new praetors. Additionally, the aristocracy was growing increasingly alarmed by Caesar's rising power. They feared his influence, and since he was set to become proconsul the following year, they attempted to assign him insignificant responsibilities, offering him control over forests and pastures in Italy. However, Caesar managed to overturn this decision. He secured governance over Cisalpine Gaul and Illyria, later expanding his authority to include Transalpine Gaul as well. This granted him command over 4 legions, an invaluable asset. Meanwhile, lawsuits accusing him of illegal actions during his consulship were piling up, so the opportunity to leave Rome and distance himself from these accusations was highly convenient. His proconsulship in Gaul marked a turning point in his career. When he left for Gaul, he was deeply in debt, and he saw military campaigns as the perfect way to amass wealth. Furthermore, Illyria and parts of Gaul bordered regions that Rome had not yet conquered, presenting a chance for expansion. Gaul itself was rife with internal conflicts, which weakened its tribes. Even though they resisted Roman control, their constant infighting left them too exhausted to put up a unified front. Within just his second year in Gaul, Caesar had subdued the Belgae, who were considered the fiercest of the Gallic tribes. By 56 BCE, he controlled most of western Gaul. During a winter break, he met with Pompey and Crassus, where they agreed that Caesar would remain in Gaul for another 5 years to complete the conquest from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, while Pompey and Crassus would secure the consulship for the following year. Caesar then launched expeditions into Germania and Britain. His stay in Britain was brief due to a storm damaging his fleet and the approaching winter, which made prolonged campaigns impractical. However, the local tribes formally pledged allegiance to Rome, and Caesar, satisfied with this diplomatic success, returned to Gaul. Although he had not conquered new lands or seized significant spoils, these expeditions were historically significant. No Roman general had ever set foot in Britain before. The island was an unknown frontier, and his journey there brought him immense fame. Caesar extended Rome's influence up to the Rhine. Meanwhile, newly subdued tribes in Gaul began to revolt, forcing him to deal with fresh uprisings. The most serious of these was led by Vercingetorix in 52 BCE. He was the first leader to successfully unite the Gallic tribes against Rome, and Gaul had no shortage of warriors. Vercingetorix posed the first true challenge to Caesar, as previous opponents had been mere nuisances. Unlike them, he implemented a scorched earth strategy, which significantly troubled Caesar. He even managed to defeat Caesar in one battle, which boosted his confidence. However, when he launched another attack on Caesar's forces, the outcome was different. Caesar commanded a professional Roman army, while Vercingetorix led a coalition of tribes that had only recently stopped fighting among themselves. Caesar ultimately defeated him, forcing Vercingetorix to retreat. He then laid siege to the stronghold of Alesia. After a prolonged and intense battle, the Romans emerged victorious, and Vercingetorix surrendered. 6 years later, he was executed in Rome. Though this was not the last Gallic revolt, subsequent uprisings were swiftly and ruthlessly crushed by Caesar. According to Plutarch, his campaigns resulted in the conquest of 800 Gallic cities and 300 tribes. Many defeated Gauls were sold into slavery, while countless others perished. This was likely the largest military campaign since Alexander the Great's invasion of Persia. Caesar amassed immense wealth, not only from the tributes paid by subdued regions but primarily from war spoils. He took whatever he could, as he needed funds to settle his debts and secure his own army. Wealth meant power. When he had first set out for Gaul, he commanded 4 legions. By the time he returned, he led 13 and was one of the richest men in Rome. I also can't leave out his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, the Gallic War, arguably his most famous literary work and one of the most significant texts from antiquity. Beyond chronicling his military campaigns, he provided detailed descriptions of Gallic customs and traditions. He was also the first to distinguish between Gauls and Germans, as until then, Germans had been considered just another Gallic tribe. Thanks to his writings, it became clear that they were an entirely distinct people. Caesar returned to Rome as an immensely powerful figure. Several legates, his trusted officers, served under him. These legates managed provinces, led diplomatic missions, and commanded armies on his behalf. Among them were notable figures such as Mark Antony and Brutus. Despite, or perhaps because of, his military successes, Caesar was deeply unpopular among conservative senators. They feared that he sought to become Rome's sole ruler. And they weren't entirely wrong. The last agreement between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus was the election of Pompey and Crassus as consuls and the extension of Caesar's proconsulship. In 54 BCE, however, Caesar's daughter Julia died in childbirth, severing his familial bond with Pompey. The following year, Crassus was killed in battle. At that time, Caesar was still in Gaul. Hoping to salvage his alliance with Pompey, he offered him the hand of one of his great-nieces in marriage. But Pompey declined and instead married the daughter of one of Caesar's greatest political enemies. Pompey was now in power and ordered Caesar to return to Rome, disband his army, as his proconsular term had ended. He forbade him from running for consul again and refused to grant him new provinces, having seen how much Caesar had already gained. However, Caesar knew that the moment he gave up his army and entered Rome, his political career would be over. So, he kept 1 legion, crossed the Rubicon River, and famously declared, "The die is cast." Pompey was reluctant to face Caesar in battle, so he retreated, with Caesar in pursuit. Caesar hoped to catch him, but Pompey managed to escape to Greece, and Caesar didn't have a strong enough navy to chase him across the sea. Instead, Caesar defeated Pompey's forces in Hispania, as an army without its general is much easier to defeat than a general with his army. He returned to Rome as a dictator but resigned after just 11 days, choosing instead to be elected consul for a second time. Determined to defeat Pompey, he took 15,000 men and set off for Greece. However, in their first battle, he suffered a serious defeat and barely avoided complete disaster. He withdrew, waited for reinforcements, and in their second encounter, he decisively crushed Pompey. Pompey's supporters scattered across the empire, attempting to stir up resistance against Caesar, while Pompey himself fled to Egypt. There, he was executed on the orders of Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Caesar was presented only with Pompey's severed head, but he still demanded the rest of his remains and ensured he was buried with all the honors due to his status. With this act, Caesar sought to portray himself as just, even towards his former rivals. This was also the moment when Caesar became entangled with Ptolemy and, more notably, his sister Cleopatra. But I discussed that in more detail elsewhere, and this video is already long enough. If you're interested, you can check out my video on Cleopatra. Caesar remained in Egypt for several months before duty called him away. The king of Pontus, Pharnaces, had attacked Roman provinces in Asia Minor. Caesar arrived quickly and, within 5 days, crushed Pharnaces. With that settled, Veni, Vidi, Vici, he immediately marched to Africa, where he still had some of Pompey's remaining supporters to deal with. He utterly annihilated them, to such an extent that when Cato learned of the massacre, he chose to take his own life rather than face the consequence. In 45 BCE, the Roman Republic was nearing its end. In September, Caesar returned to Italy, having been elected consul for the 4th time, this time as the sole consul, with a 10-year term. Upon his arrival, he appointed Octavian as his successor to make it clear that no one else had a reason to remove him, or so he believed. Unlike previous dictators, he did not issue proscriptions but instead granted amnesty to all his opponents. He organized grand games and festivities, and the Senate granted him the title of dictator for life. Caesar cultivated a divine cult around himself. He had a statue erected with the inscription to the invincible god and placed it in the Temple of Quirinus. He also had coins minted with his own portrait, something unprecedented in Rome. It was the first time in Roman history that a living person appeared on currency. During his rule, he introduced numerous reforms. One of the most significant concerned citizenship. He generously granted Roman citizenship to Gallic, Hispanic, and African inhabitants of the provinces, greatly accelerating Romanization in these regions. Some Gallic chieftains even became senators, which was a huge shift in the Roman political landscape. To address overcrowding in Rome, he founded 20 new colonies across the Roman state. But perhaps his most enduring reform was his calendar. He introduced a new system with 365 days and a leap year every 4 years, the Julian calendar. This system remained in use until 1582 when it was refined into the Gregorian calendar, which we still use today. However, Caesar didn't get to enjoy his dictatorship for long. He ruled for only 5 years before he was assassinated in a Senate meeting. Tensions between Caesar and the Senate escalated over time, as senators feared he sought to make himself king and establish tyranny. Historians still debate whether he truly intended to claim the throne or if he was satisfied with his dictatorship. Romans, especially conservatives, despised monarchy, and Caesar was aware of this. However, his confidence only grew, and he continued consolidating power. He stripped both tribunes of their office, and when addressed as king, he reportedly replied, "I am not a king, I am Caesar." Brutus and several other senators decided to take matters into their own hands. They formed a conspiracy group called the Liberatores, the Liberators, and began plotting his assassination. Getting rid of someone like Caesar was no easy task. An estimated 60 people were involved in the plot, and they were advised to always carry a dagger in case they were discovered. The final straw for them allegedly came when senators came to inform Caesar that he had been granted the title Father of the Fatherland, and he received them while sitting, refusing to stand, a grave sign of disrespect. That was the moment they decided he had to go. On March 15, 44 BCE, Caesar was invited to a Senate session at Pompey's theater. But this was merely a ruse, no meeting was actually scheduled. The day before, he reportedly had a conversation with a cavalry commander who asked him what kind of death he considered best. Caesar supposedly replied, "A sudden one." Whether this is true or just a later embellishment is unclear, but it is undeniably poetic. On the morning of March 15, Caesar was reportedly feeling unwell and considered skipping the meeting. There were many omens warning him not to go. His wife allegedly had a nightmare predicting his doom. Caesar even sent word that he might not attend, but Brutus and the conspirators had planned this moment for too long to let it slip away. Brutus himself went to convince Caesar, urging him not to delay the meeting. On their way to the theater, Caesar supposedly received a letter warning him of the plot, but he set it aside to read later, a moment that never came. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies, had suspicions about an impending attack. According to some sources, Caesar had also been warned, but neither of them took the threats seriously enough. Mark Antony even tried to delay Caesar from entering the theater, but one of the conspirators distracted him long enough for Caesar to proceed inside. Inside the Senate chamber, one of the conspirators pulled on Caesar's toga. This was the signal. The others quickly surrounded him, each carrying a dagger. Caesar tried to escape, but he was unable to push through the crowd. His last words remain unknown. Despite popular belief, he likely never uttered "Et Brute," that line was Shakespeare's invention. Brutus was not actually Caesar's son, despite what Asterix and Obelix might suggest. Though it is true that Caesar had an affair with Brutus's mother, among many other women, as he had numerous lovers. After Caesar's death, chaos erupted. Mark Antony, who had originally been a target himself, played both sides, denouncing Caesar as a tyrant while also refusing to punish the conspirators. However, he stirred public sentiment against them, leading to violent riots that lasted for months, forcing the conspirators to flee Rome. Struggles over Caesar's legacy and succession soon followed, plunging Rome into 13 more years of civil war. But to many Romans, Caesar's death was not the end. Shortly after, a great comet was visible in the sky for 7 days, and people saw it as a sign of his deification. They named it Caesar's Comet, one of the most famous comets in ancient history. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know it was long and intense, so thanks for sticking with it. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Take care, and see you next time.